So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us again to the grand finale of our election webinar series. Here we are 5 days away from what we're starting to call count day and not election day. This is a term Cliff has coined for it because we've already seen about 80 million ballots cast for this election. Quite likely we're going to see 100 million votes cast even before next Tuesday. So Tuesday is really going to be the day that we start tallying everything up because this election is already in progress. If you've joined us before, you should know the drill. We're going to take you through a lot of our latest data and insights to understand what's happening, to try to make sense of what we're going to be seeing here over the next couple of days and prepare everyone for election night, the next day, count night, I should say, the next day, and potentially into the next week, depending on how things work out. But first, let's start off with the context, because this election is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening amidst the most potentially chaotic year that the United States has had in the last 100. There is a lot going on, and that has very much colored this election. It's very much affected how this election has unfolded. And first and foremost is the coronavirus pandemic. It continues to rage across the country. We're seeing daily new highs in the number of cases, particularly in some of the regions of the country that hadn't really dealt with it yet, including the upper Midwest, where they are seeing major numbers of new cases. But we're seeing it across the country at this point. Almost every state is seeing an uptick in the number of cases. And we are starting to see the number of deaths resulting from coronavirus starting to tick up as well. So the coronavirus pandemic is very much central to the agenda. It is dominating conversation. It is very top of mind for Americans when we survey them. And it's very much coloring the election as we go into these last couple of days. And then there's the economy, which is inextricably linked to the coronavirus pandemic. And we've seen this sort of V-shaped recovery at first, where we had that abrupt shutdown in March and April as we tried to get the coronavirus pandemic under control at the beginning, and then a quick bounce back. But what we're starting to see is a little bit of a flattening of the improvement. I've talked to a number of economists in recent days where we aren't expecting to necessarily make up all of the ground back to where we were before the pandemic, and that has a lingering effect too in affecting how people are viewing things going into this election next week. And I think something that's always important to keep in mind, though, and something that really helps make sense of the world that we live in, is just the extent to which we are all seeing it through alternate realities. And these alternate realities are based on partisanship, and they're based on how we get our information, how we get our news. I'm showing you some slides from our recent Axios polling and recent Reuters polling. And the first is looking at if people believe the official death toll is exaggerated or not. And what we see is that among Republicans who get their news from Fox News, 2/3 of them believe the official death toll is exaggerated, compared to only about 1/3 of Republicans who get their news from the traditional nightly news outlets. And we see a similar pattern with independents, where independents who get news from Fox are much more likely to believe the death toll is exaggerated versus those who don't. And we see a similar sort of pattern when we ask about Trump's approval of Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. The majority of Republicans, of course, approve of his handling of it, but we see a huge difference between Fox News Republicans and non-Fox News Republicans, where Fox News Republicans almost universally approve of how Trump's handled it, versus non-Fox, where there's about 1/3 who disapprove of his handling of the pandemic. And then again, these similar patterns where people who get their news from Fox are more supportive of the president than those who are not. And this is, I think, really important to understand that we're not even necessarily always talking about the same reality. We are, in a lot of ways, some of us are talking about Mars and others Venus. There's this very strong divergence in what we understand to be ground truths or ground facts. And that's important as we go into next week, because I think how the election plays out, particularly if it ends up being a close election, which we still see as very possible, how the various media outlets report on it and how partisans interpret that reporting is going to really impact how we all handle that post-election period. And then finally, this slide I love to use to really underline how important this election is. We took this language from the Democratic Convention, this idea that we're in a battle for the soul of the nation. We see a majority, a super majority of people agree with the statement across party lines, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. Everyone agrees with the statement that this election is a battle for the soul of the nation. It really underlines the extent to which this feels like an existential event. We're certainly seeing in a lot of our public opinion data more intention to vote, more intention to be involved in the election than we've seen in decades. That's certainly being supported by the early vote numbers we're seeing, which again are historic levels. And this is, I think, being colored also by most people not thinking the country is going in a good direction. Republicans, of course, a bare majority believe the country's in the right direction, but we see essentially 3/4 of all other Americans believe the country is headed off on the wrong track. And you combine these two things with the country going in a bad direction, with this sort of idea that it's a battle for the soul of the nation. And it really, I think, underlines the stakes. It underlines the intensity of emotion we're seeing and why everybody's so anxious and fraught here as we head into these last few days. So then turning slightly to look at President Trump, he is the incumbent president. This election very much is a referendum on him. He is the center. He's the gravitational well around the entire election is revolving or orbiting. So really understanding how people are perceiving him really helps make sense of what's happening right now. And the first thing to point out is that he's actually had a remarkably stable approval rating through his entire presidency. It's really unprecedented. Typically, presidents see their approval ratings change a little bit over the course of their presidency. You know, you have sort of the most extreme cases like George W. Bush, who got up to like the high 80s in approval and then dropped down to the low 30s across the course of his presidency. But even Barack Obama saw his approval numbers bounce around about 20 percentage points across the course of his presidency. But Donald Trump has seen very little movement. He has been essentially somewhere between 40 and 45% for virtually his entire presidency. And I think this is a testament to just how powerful these divergent realities have become, but also a testament to just how powerful Donald Trump's personal brand has become and how the story he tells of what he symbolizes is become extremely sticky and salient to a large number of Americans, you know, at least 40% of Americans who stay behind him essentially no matter what. Because remember, this is a guy who's presided over essentially what feels like a weekly series of scandals, of outrages. You know, he was impeached at the beginning of the year. He's presided over the coronavirus pandemic and the economic downturn. You know, the Charlottesville protests in 2017, and then the social justice protests this summer. All of these events, all of these huge major political events haven't really moved his opinions of him much at all, not within maybe 5 percentage points of his sort of natural resting place of around 42, 43%. And his approval rating is sort of interesting because if we look around the world at incumbent presidents with an approval rating of about 40%, more often than not, they should be able to win re-election. If we just sort of look around, you know, 6 times out of 10, an incumbent president with an approval rating of that number wins re-election. So at the beginning of the year, we really thought that Donald Trump was kind of the favorite going into this election before the pandemic and before everything else happened. And his approval rating still gives us pause as we look forward into next week's results, because it is still strong enough to suggest he should have a decent chance. And when you look at him compared to past presidents, we can see that he's in a little bit of a middle position, right? His approval rating is not as strong as those incumbent presidents who successfully won re-election, including Barack Obama, but it's not as weak as those incumbent presidents who have lost their re-election bids like H.W. Bush or Jimmy Carter. So he is in a little bit of this middling position, and I think that's why this election is competitive. He's not so overwhelmingly popular that it's the challengers essentially got no chance, but he's not so overwhelmingly unpopular that he's essentially a lock to get thrown out. And that's, I think, the real sort of key dimension we're seeing here. The other key that I mentioned to keep in mind is that it doesn't really matter what his approval rating is at the national level because it's an electoral college system. It's about winning the right amount of states to get to that 270 margin. And what we see is that Donald Trump's approval rate is actually a little bit higher in a lot of these states that we're focusing on as our swing states. He continues to be more popular in the upper Midwest, along the South Atlantic, and in the Southwest than he is at the nation as a whole. I think that's important to keep in mind because that's essentially why these are battleground states, right? Because it's not, in California or in New York, he's overwhelmingly unpopular. His approval rating is like 30% or less. But in these states, in these regions, his approval ratings may be a little closer to 45%. That's high enough to give him a decent chance. And that's why we're so focused on these states as the ones to watch in the next couple of days. And then finally, and I think this is actually why we've seen the election turn, is that the coronavirus pandemic is just dominating conversation, and Trump's credibility on the coronavirus is very weak. He's had a series of trying to downplay it, of sort of trying to make it not seem like a big deal. He's constantly talking about how we're turning the corner. And people are being confronted with it in their daily lives. We're all still having to social distance. We're all still wearing masks. We're all sort of seeing it in our day in, day out life. And we have over 200,000 Americans who've died now from the coronavirus. So it's touched many, many lives. And what we're showing you is just an example, a case study of this. When we, in our Axios survey, asked people if they would get the first generation COVID vaccine, if various people vouched for its safety, President Trump was essentially the worst. Only 19%, essentially 1 in 5 Americans, said that they would be likely to get it if Trump said it was safe. Compare that to 62% if their personal physician, their personal doctor say it was safe. And it just, I think, illustrates how weak Trump is in this space. And because coronavirus has become such a central focus of this election, it's really put him on his back foot in terms of campaigning. It's made it hard for him to make an affirmative case for why he should be reelected. That would have been different than if the economy was in a good place, where he's actually has a lot of credibility on the economy, where people think he's been a pretty good steward of the economy, particularly up to before the coronavirus pandemic began. Because of this focus, it's really made it very hard for him to make this case. Like, for instance, I think it's even striking when we ask people if they had to pay $100 to get the coronavirus vaccine, more people said they'd do it, right? More people would say they'd do it if they had to pay than if Trump vouched for its safety. I think that really just sort of speaks to sort of Trump's weakness in this particular issue, this particular area, which has really been the thing that's making it very hard for him to make his case. So let's turn then to what we're seeing in our general election data. There is a mountain of polling coming out. It's an avalanche. It's hard to keep up with. I would advise people to, watch our site, of course, but also look at the aggregators to try to keep up with it. But one thing to sort of understand is, like I mentioned earlier, this election is very much about Donald Trump. Joe Biden is really a secondary figure. If Trump is, the Earth in my earlier sort of gravity metaphor, Joe Biden's really kind of the moon, right? Sort of orbiting around. And when we did an experiment recently where we asked people to attach various attributes to Biden or Trump, and then looked at if they supported Biden or Trump in the election, what we see is that the election is really being defined by Trump first and foremost. For people voting for Trump, it's about all the things they like about him, that he's strong and bold, that he represents their version of the American dream and stands for law and order. And for the people voting for Biden, it's really more about how these people feel about Donald Trump too, how they think he is narrow-minded or corrupt or reckless or a bully. By comparison, Biden is actually much less of a central figure. There's not actually a lot of things either pushing people away from Biden or pulling them towards Biden. He is a little bit of a more generic Democrat in this regards, where he's essentially benefiting from the strong emotions that Trump is generating to be a safe landing place for all these people wanting to register their disapproval of the president. And it's actually, in one light, been a relatively successful campaign strategy for the Biden camp of being essentially non-confrontational, not making an issue of everything, and essentially keeping the focus on the president. However, that is a little bit of a risky strategy because Biden does not have any intrinsic positions of his own brand is not particularly strong. That means Trump really does still continue to control what's happening in the election. It's not necessarily 100% in his control, but it's all around him, right? It's all in response to him. And there were cases to be made. Some experts, political experts, were talking that, even as recently as Trump's COVID diagnosis a few weeks ago, he could have potentially pivoted and helped neutralize some of these negative sentiments. But Trump is Trump, and he is continuing to sort of double down on his approach. So we're really seeing sort of a continuation of the trajectory of the election as it's been. So as I mentioned before, coronavirus is the main issue. We've been tracking this over time, and what we see is that of the sort of the four issues that are sort of the top topics when we ask people what they're concerned about, the coronavirus has been opening up a larger gap over the second tier issues. You can see back in August, they had all gotten actually really close together. There was a period where it looked like Trump was going to actually be able to successfully move the agenda back to the economy, which is good ground for him. But as the pandemic rages here now, we're seeing it become an increasing focus of the election, of the electorate, and Biden is seen as stronger on that issue. And that's also important because, again, when we look around the world, at elections around the world, what we see is 4 out of 5 times the candidate who is strongest on the issue people think is the most important tends to win elections. So it's a good sort of rule of thumb. And that tells us, again, right now that Biden's in a strong position vis-a-vis the president. So when we look at just the polling, right, and there's a lot of polling coming out right now, the Reuters Ipsos poll, our tracker, we kind of have coming out twice a week, shows Biden with a 10-point lead, 10 percentage point lead among likely voters. We're actually working on our poll for today. That'll be coming out sometime this afternoon. And then we'll do another final poll the day before election on Monday to try to capture things. But one thing we're seeing, especially with all the polls that are being released publicly beyond just what our work is there's actually a huge range of potential outcomes, everything from Biden winning by a point or two to Biden winning by 16 or 17 points. And what I think that reflects is how there is actually still some uncertainty when you get below the top line numbers, right? What I was just showing you is essentially our synthesis of a bunch of data together to create that trend line, to create that sort of top line ballot, but you can actually dig underneath that and see some interesting things going on. So for instance, we have early vote, and we're seeing essentially a large number of Americans have already voted. Even more say they plan to have voted before Election Day, so that we may see about 60% of all votes cast before we even get to Election Day. And that introduces some uncertainty. We also have different levels of certainty to vote, that is, people actually going out to vote, actually casting their votes by the various candidates. That adds some uncertainty. And then we even have a little bit of uncertainty around if people are actually certain who they're going to support. Now, these numbers are certainly smaller than we've seen in some past elections, but it still exists. And then finally, there are still some undecided voters, not many, 5, 6%, compared to like 12 or 15% at this point in 2016. But those people also potentially in some of these states that are close, like in the Southwest or the Sun Belt, those undecided voters might be enough to sway the results. So when you actually add all of these various levels of uncertainty together, you actually see why there's quite so much of a range in the numbers that are being produced in the public polls. This is taking our Reuters Ipsos poll and sort of disaggregating some of these data points. You can kind of see how some of these numbers are coming together. And what it shows is that over time, of course, we have the early vote coming in, we have the people who've already cast, and that sort of votes in the bank. And Joe Biden has definitely been benefiting from that up to this point where he has a lot of votes already in the bank. But we can see there's actually some uncertainty where people who are probably going to vote for the candidates but aren't a sure thing. And then we have the undecided voters who may lean one way or the other. And that introduces some uncertainty. And what that tells us is that there is a range of possibilities for the two candidates. There's a range of potential outcomes. And for Joe Biden, that range appears to be narrowing as we get closer to Election Day. But for Donald Trump, there's still actually a wide range of potential vote totals that he can get. And I think, again, that's sort of speaking to why there's a little bit of uncertainty in the numbers we're seeing, is because there's so many things going on underneath the hood that suggests that can feed into rather these estimates. So then if we take our data and we sort of start to project it forward, and this is going to transition into our next section talking about election forecasting, we see over 78 million ballots have already been cast. Right now, Biden is holding, we think, about a 2-to-1 lead in these ballots that have already been cast. Of the vote that remains, actually Trump actually has more voters that remain to cast their votes. So as we look forward to next week, and particularly to Election Day or count day, Trump is probably going to have the lion's share of people who go out and vote on that day are going to be Trump supporters. Maybe 60-40, maybe even a little bit of a greater ratio. So as we see the vote totals start to get reported on Election Day, depending on how the state counts things up, we may see a huge lead for one side or the other, right? So if we see them start to report the vote that was cast in person on Election Day, Trump's going to jump out to a big lead. But then as they count the early vote, we'll see Biden's numbers catch up. And then if they start the early vote first, we'll see Biden jump out to that huge lead before Trump then catches up, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind as you watch election returns, is that there's probably going to be some weird things happening with the reported returns, depending on how people are doing their counts in each of these states. But the focus should remain not necessarily on the national number, though the national number is interesting and indicative. It should remain on the battleground states, because it's going to be the Electoral College that ultimately decides it. We don't think that Trump has a very likely scenario to win a popular vote majority. His path is through the Electoral College, is through winning these states, and particularly it's through winning the states in the Southeast, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, potentially the states in the Southwest like Texas and Arizona, and then finally being able to pick up something in the Midwest to sort of stitch together that 270 majority he needs to win. Joe Biden has an easier path. He's in a stronger position in more states. However, what we saw in 2016 is typically if we see things move, they kind of move across the board. So, it is definitely still in the realm of possibility that Donald Trump could pull this out. So as we look closer to at our states, our Reuters Ipsos polling suggests that Michigan and Wisconsin are pretty solidly for Biden right now. And if we apply the same modeling exercise that I was showing you earlier with the national data, we see in Michigan and Wisconsin, even in sort of a worst case scenario, Biden looks likely to still win. However, when we look at the other states, we actually see it could still go either way. In Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina right now, the polls have Biden up slightly, somewhere between 2 and 4 points. But again, applying sort of these different conditions, these different levels of uncertainty, there's very much scenarios where Trump can win in Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. And there's even a scenario where Trump can tie in Pennsylvania. And if a tie happens, that's where some of the legal challenges, some of the legal issues that you've seen raised about how the votes are counted, how absentee or early votes counted, that can come into play, that can matter, right? If we see the vote totals within a percentage point, that's where these kind of rules really can start to make a difference in how the actual results happen. So Trump has a path, certainly. If he can take Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and he can get that, close to that tie in Pennsylvania where his incumbency can be an advantage, he has that path to victory. However, Biden has probably the easier path at this moment in time. So let's turn forward and look at what are we expecting over the next couple of days. And I've made this point in past webinars, and I just want to do it again, that the election polls, what we've essentially been talking about mostly up to this point, are not the same as a forecast about what's going to happen in the future. An election poll is by definition a retrospective exercise. It is looking into the past, right? We interviewed these people yesterday or last week, and even though we're asking them about their future behaviors, they're really just telling us how they feel at that moment. Maybe they'll continue to feel that way next week, maybe they won't. Indeed, that's what we think happened in 2016, is there's a lot of people who in the last week or 2 weeks of the election were still telling us that they were undecided, but come election day, they decided to vote for Trump. We saw Trump in some of the late polls picking up ground and closing the margin. And I think if we had had more polls up to the day before the day of election, we would have seen Trump continuing to close that margin. That's why this year we're actually doing state polls up to next Sunday and Monday, and our final national poll on Monday to try to make sure we capture any of that late movement if it happens. But doing an election forecast is really about trying to get as much information and triangulate on what we think is going to happen as possible. I like to use the metaphor of using a poll to predict what's going to happen in the future as like if you see somebody running down the street and you close your eyes and try to guess where they are in a minute. Maybe you'll be right, maybe you won't. But doing an election forecast is about looking at that person running down the street and then looking around seeing, are there other cars, are there other pedestrians, are there places where the street turns, and trying to have more information so that you can make a better guess about what you think is going to happen in the future. So as we do that, we're looking around, we're looking at all the other information that's out there, and there's lots and lots and lots of it. Our friends at the University of Virginia, Crystal Ball, are using sort of their expert analysis, their vote counters, their people who've been following things at a very minute level for years, or the Political Report. Right now, they're both saying that the election's probably going to go for Biden. We also see the sort of the modelers, the data guys, like at The Economist or 538, they're saying the election's going to go for Biden. The media, who are sort of more horse racy, like at Politico, or betting markets like Predict It. And what we're seeing is increasingly there's sort of a consensus that the election is most likely going to go for Biden, but it's not a certain thing. There's still some academics that believe Trump can pull this out, right? And then when we look at our data, we're seeing a picture that's a little bit more cloudy. So if we just look at the polls, the horse race polls, Biden's in a stronger position across the board, but it's not necessarily a slam dunk across all these states. We have places like Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina where it's within the margin of error, and that Donald Trump could certainly win those states. And then if we look at Trump's approval rating, we see his approval rating remains strong and remains strong in a lot of these states. It's, 45, 46%. And that suggests he has that reservoir of support, that reservoir of voters who are behind him, who are willing to turn out. And I don't think anyone should ever discount that. We look at the main issue. Coronavirus continues the main issue. Biden is seen as much stronger on that. That's bad terrain for the president. And this is the area that we really thought that the election may hinge on. And it really has broken sort of against the president in the last couple of weeks, particularly once he was diagnosed with COVID. And if we'd seen the economy reemerge, we think that might have changed things. And then there's some other heuristics. So we're looking at things like fundraising. We're seeing that Biden is actually outraising President Trump, and fundraising doesn't mean a lot by itself. But it does tell you, especially now that most fundraising is more small dollar, it tells you another sort of measure of intensity of support. And we can even look at things like social net sentiment, where we're looking at social media and the conversation on social media. And we're actually seeing that sort of breaking even right now, whereas in 2016, Donald Trump was dominating in social media over Hillary Clinton. And when we sort of combine all of these things together, we're presented with a picture where at the national level, it looks like Trump is not very likely to win, 1 in 10 maybe. But a lot of these states, he has better odds, right? We think it's basically a coin flip in Arizona, Florida, or North Carolina. We think it's probably a bit worse than a coin flip in the Midwest. But when you take all of those things together, it does present to us a path for Trump that we're not necessarily willing to discount. So when we pull it all together and we sort of look forward, we think Trump still has maybe about a 1 in 4 chance of winning this thing, primarily through that electoral college path we've talked about. And Biden has essentially a 75%, a 3 in 4 chance. And of that, we think there's maybe about a 1 in 4 chance of a blue wave, and that may be ticking up here in the last couple of days as the polls continue to show strength for Biden, which would be Biden winning the electoral college in a huge margin, Democrats taking the Senate, controlling the House, potentially picking up a bunch of state governments. But we still think sort of the most likely scenario at this moment is a more narrow Biden win, where he wins the popular vote, he wins the electoral college, but it's not those overwhelming numbers, right? It's not the the tidal wave necessarily that some Democrats are hoping for, but instead represents a little bit more of a smaller win. But these different scenarios are going to have different outcomes for us as a country and as a society. And I think that is important to keep in mind. Is not just who wins or loses, but how they win or lose. That's important to keep in mind as we go forward for the next couple of days. So with that, we have all of our resources here, and then Cliff, who is the head of public affairs here with Ipsos, I think you had some final comments about what people should be thinking about in the last couple of days here. And as Cliff talks, we invite folks to submit questions using the Q&A option on the program. And then after Cliff gives his remarks, we'll answer as many of the questions as we have time for.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone for bearing with us, both today as well as throughout the electoral season. Obviously, that was a wonderful, excellent analysis, Chris. I haven't seen the whole thing from beginning to end with you. Obviously, we do different things, need to be in different places, but it's a great combination of context, the horse race polls, and then combining that with multiple indicators to forecast, and really, really kind of thorough sort of exercise that was very interesting. I mean, the first thing I want to say is it's coronavirus, coronavirus, coronavirus. That is the context. That is our world. We live in the COVID-19 world. Ultimately, we will find out if one can spin a virus. I don't think so. It's hard to. They're tricky little beasts, but we will see. But obviously, Trump is trailing Biden on that also important issue. That is many times the starting point in any election for us to understand the context, to understand those issues, and it goes without saying that it is all about the pandemic. The second point I wanted to make is just the concept of uncertainty. And, whether it be forecasting or just research in general, when we're working with clients and stakeholders, talking about outcomes, it's one thing to talk about averages, vote share, I don't know, the volume of sales, whatever it might be. It's quite another to give the notion of uncertainty about your outcome, right? And in our assessment, the primary error in 2016 was not necessarily about the point estimates, and I'll come back to that in a bit. It wasn't necessarily about the polling, but there are some caveats there. It was really about ours, both at Ipsos as well as just the industry in general, our ability to express uncertainty and a wavering level of conviction about what the outcome was going to be. And indeed, if you actually peel away the onion, and Chris made this point, and look at the week-to-week polls in the last month of 2016, there was a narrowing, there was a bottoming out of Clinton and a Trump gaining ground, those signals did not make their way through the clutter. And so I would say the primary learning from 2016, obviously there was methodological issues in some of the states getting at rural populations, rural white populations, which I believe as an industry we've adjusted for, at least in part, we've minimized it, but was the ability to express uncertainty. And I think to Chris's point, there is uncertainty here. Indeed, as you were looking at the different indicators that we laid out, we have different scenarios. If you look at approval ratings, Trump is stronger. If you look at many other indicators, Biden is stronger. What should that suggest to all of us? It should give us pause. And it should give us pause and say, maybe our level of certainty shouldn't be so high. Now, it's higher, I believe, and I'll kind of close with this. It's higher, I believe, than it was in 2016. But there's still uncertainty because we have mixed signals. And anytime we have mixed signals, and Chris and I have done, we were trying to count how many elections, dozens, if not 100 or more, depending on how you count them, elections, and we've had very few with mixed signals. And this is like the second memorable one, the first being 2016, where we had mixed signals. Now, those mixed signals this year are more attenuated. They're not as stark. And I think most importantly, we're not seeing the same sort of trend towards Trump this year as we did in 2016. We're not getting that signal, so that stability is actually good for Biden. But I would keep my eyes peeled for the horse race polls at the state level, especially in those key swing states. As they come out, are we seeing any sort of trend towards narrowing? Because that could be a signal. Ultimately, might not capture at the last day, the day before count day, the exact level of vote. But if there's a trend towards Trump, for instance, or if there's stability, that's quite suggestive of the ultimate outcome. So that being said, we do think it's going to be more Biden than Trump. Maybe a little, I wouldn't say a lot Biden, but strongly Biden. But there's uncertainty. And we're still looking for those signals in all the noise in order to gauge over the next few days where things will land on count day. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Chris. Thank you so much. Awesome series, awesome presentation. Knock on wood, because we need that. Lots of stress. But I'm going to hand it over to you for questions from our audience.
Thank you, Cliff. Yeah, knock on wood that we get through the next couple of days without losing our hair. All right, so questions. One, asking Democrats do not get their news from Fox. 3 question marks. No, and I think that's actually part and parcel of the alternate realities we're living in. Is, there's still a number of people who are getting their news from the traditional nightly news broadcasts, ABC, CBS, NBC, but increasingly we're seeing Democrats going to MSNBC or CNN and Republicans going to Fox, and there's just not a lot of overlap. There's just not a lot of Republicans who watch MSNBC. There's not a lot of Democrats who watch Fox. So increasingly people are hearing these sort of alternate versions of reality, and that's just feeding in and reinforcing that cycle of sort of believing everything's different and sort of believing the other side's not just wrong, but sort of morally evil. It's a concept called negative partisanship. And that's actually one of the things, if you've ever been on one of our Age of Uncertainty presentations, that we really focus on as one of the central drivers of a lot of the animosity and uncertainty in society right now. What is the reason the Supreme Court said no to extending the deadline in Wisconsin, but not in Pennsylvania? Not really a court watcher. I don't know, Cliff, do you have a point view on that?
I do not know. That's a great question, and we'll have to sort of punt that one.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that that is problematic for Trump because Pennsylvania is the state that he's got the better chances in right now. But why the court decided to do one thing in one place and not in the other, we're public opinion experts, not legal scholars. I hope you will do an election debrief sometime in mid-November. We're going to do one of these after the election, Cliff?
If there's good news, right? Only. No, yes, right. I think we should. I think it'd be great. I think that whatever happens, we always do postmortems. I think it'd be very interesting for us to share that, not just the technical postmortem, did we get it right or not, and if we did and why, but more importantly, just really sort of reassessing those key issues that played in voter decision making. We do have a same day poll, don't we?
Yes, we'll be doing about 40 to 50,000 interviews on Tuesday with Reuters. They'll be reporting it out in detail Wednesday morning. So we'll have certainly a lot of data to share.
Great.
How do the swing state odds compare to Clinton versus Trump at this point in 2016? Well, that's one of the things where I think we, as Cliff was talking about, and please jump in here, Cliff, is that we sort of, there was a point about 3 or 4 weeks ahead of the election in 2016, after some of the debates where Clinton opened up a large lead. It was shortly after the Access Hollywood tapes dropped, if you remember those. where Trump said some derogatory things. And, I think people got a little fixed on where the races were at that point. And at that point, Clinton was in a very strong position. She was actually a little ahead of where Biden is right now in some places. But what happened is over the 4 weeks between then and Election Day, those margins narrowed, and they narrowed and they narrowed and they narrowed to the point where the polling average the days before the election essentially had Clinton up 3 points over Trump. She actually won the national popular vote by 2 points, so we're relatively close. But I think that's vastly different than where we are right now, where Biden is up more like 8 or 9 points over Trump. At the same time, Clinton was 3 points. But, we were talking about these upper Midwestern states like Clinton was the overwhelming favorite, when a closer reading of the data, and most of them would have suggested she's not. Biden is currently got a larger margin, particularly in Wisconsin and Michigan, than Clinton had. A little bit larger, though close to the same in Pennsylvania. And then in the Sun Belt states, they're relatively close, though I do think Biden is actually about a point ahead of where Clinton was. Florida even, again, as we were sort of looking at 2016 data, Florida had actually swung back to Trump at about this point before the election. So Trump was actually the favorite in Florida, which again, I think we sort of forget about a little bit in reflection. So Biden has got better odds at the moment than Clinton did. If you're using a good, true reading of where the data wasn't necessarily how we were talking about it though at the time. Can you predict the impact of early vote versus day of vote volume and compare that to how it's worked out in prior presidential elections?
Not really.
Yeah.
And let me just be and the question is why? Well, first and foremost, the weight is changing over time. So a greater proportion of the population is voting early. And the profile of the individual voting early is changing. So it's really hard to use the past to predict the future. Indeed, I'd even go as far as saying we shouldn't use any of the early voting as a leading indicator of anything. That's one of the false signals, the false positives, let's call it, for Clinton in 2016, was to use the early voting figures and somehow project those out to Election Day. I mean, the populations that vote on Election Day and early voting are completely different, though they're changing, as I was saying before, because increasingly more people are voting. I would just that's just, completely sort of wrought with problems. And so I would just stay away from it as any sort of reasonable indicator of what's going to happen. Do you agree with that, Chris?
I do, yeah. I think the only thing the early vote tells us is that a lot of people have voted early.
Yep.
That's about it. Anything else is just essentially conjecture.
Yep.
What is the likely impact of all the new voters and get out the vote efforts that have been going on, particularly on how polls track likely voters? So it depends on the poll, because different polling organizations use different approaches to forecasting likely voters. Ipsos's approach is actually relatively elastic, because what we do is we interview everybody and then we score each individual based on how likely we think they are to show up, which means that we can essentially adjust our numbers, the people that we include in our likely voter estimates, to model different sizes of the electorate, right? So right now we're using something that basically is about 65% of the electorate, which is sort of where we think the turnout level is going to end up being as our number, as the one we're using for our likely voter cut, but it allows us to have that flexibility. Other polls, though, have a more static thing where, you say that you're registered and you say that you're certain you're going to vote and you say that, whatever. Those aren't as flexible, and those potentially have a little bit more volatility with sort of these changes in what the electorate looks like. how about the 2-week trends in the battleground states, especially PA, that looks tied now, but half of voters may have already voted?
What's tied? I don't understand. You mean the early voting's tied?
Well, I'm not sure, actually. So Pennsylvania, the polling is not tied. The polling in Pennsylvania suggests Biden's up about 5 points. The early vote data, there's been a lot of early votes. I guess maybe there's been a number of articles talking about of the voter registration of the people who voted early is relatively equal, where an equal number of Democrats and Republicans have returned to their early vote ballots. But
I just would not use it. I just think that like these are all false positives or negatives, depending on how you look at it. I just, a lot of journalists will be writing on this stuff. I just wouldn't use it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important when you do, like, okay, so 40% of the electorate that have returned their ballots are Democrats, 40% are Republican. That means there's 20% that are neither, which that's everything from a 60-40 victory to a 60-40 defeat, right? That 20% that is neither, you don't know how they're going to vote, right?
You don't know
what they're
where
doing.
they're coming from either.
Exactly.
They could all be coming from Republican districts, disproportionately so versus Democratic district. We don't know. I mean, so I would just be very, very careful with that kind of stuff.
Taking into consideration that COVID's the main issue, should we use approval of his handling of the pandemic rather than his overall approval rating to forecast his position or odds?
No. No, I mean, we shouldn't because, the historical and empirical database that we have is approval ratings. It's suggestive that he's not doing well. He's underwater on the coronavirus. Mm-hmm. We should use instead his relative strength. So on the approval rating side, stick with the approval ratings as we have a very long historical and global data set that suggests what the levels mean. So let's stick with that. On the coronavirus, on issues, we should be using his performance vis-a-vis Biden's, the matchup. Because we want to know who's strongest on the main issue. That's how you should read it. So it's not that coronavirus isn't important. We just shouldn't use that metric.
Yeah. If the results are close, when do you think we'll know the result? So what I've been advising people to do, and Trump and Cliff, I'd love for you to jump in here too, is I've been advising people to watch Florida and North Carolina on election night. Those are both states that Trump really has to win to have a path, and they're both states that have relatively efficient counting processes. They usually are pretty good about getting their votes counted quickly. And if we see Biden essentially winning in either one of those states, it's going to be indicative of where the night's headed. Pennsylvania is it's the keystone state, but it's also potentially the keystone to the election. But Pennsylvania is kind of famous for taking a long time to count up their votes. And in fact, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania has already said that you shouldn't really expect a total from them until maybe Friday of next week. So, I think we're either going to know early on from what happens in Florida and North Carolina, or it may be like Friday before we have a clear indication.
Yeah, I think Florida and North Carolina are spot on. I would look at Florida. I'd look at St. Pete and the St. Petersburg and Tampa region. That kind of flickers back and forth between red and blue depending on how the state goes. And obviously North Carolina is interesting and it's important, but Florida is key. If Biden wins Florida on election night, it's over.
Yep.
And we remember Florida in 2016 as everyone's sitting there, all of us know-it-alls, sitting there going, no, it'll be okay. No. Right? Remember those vote totals coming in, and they just didn't look right.
Yeah.
Right? They were all, Clinton was seriously underperforming Obama. I remember getting actually texts from people that were imploring me to tell them it was okay. Oh yeah, it's fine. I was sitting with you actually, Chris, right? We were like, oh, it's fine. It's gonna, and I think it just kind of dawned on us, yeah, it's not going the right way.
Yeah, no,
what
at one point sometime.
Petersburg in Florida, that region, and once again, I can't remember the name of the counties,
Pinellas County, I think.
Yeah, it's split, red and blue.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Do you think the recent news of record-setting third quarter growth will have an impact on the election?
Yeah, it's too little too late.
It's pretty late. I mean, we've already seen almost 80 million people cast their ballots. The people who remain are essentially more likely to be the Trump voters anyways, and there's just not a lot of undecided voters left. This is actually...
There's a 2-month lag, typically, if you look at the econometric models. That doesn't mean that if something disastrous happens, like devaluation of a currency, which wouldn't happen necessarily in the United States, at least now, right? But if you take some emerging markets, they can have immediate impact because they affect the price of basic foodstuffs, and so you have inflation, et cetera. But this sort of stuff usually has a couple month time lag. I think it's too little too late, per Chris's point, both because people are voting early, and moreover, it's the kind of thing that takes its time to work itself out.
And I would also even wonder, because it's not like, your regular person is like a Fed watcher, like how much is that news even going to be able to break through here in the last couple of days, as so much of the focus is on the election, so much of the focus is on the campaign. I wouldn't be surprised if people didn't even know these numbers had come out. Why are you so much less bullish on the Senate races for the Democrats? I mean, it's not that we're less bullish. It's just that we think that the Senate is going to really move pretty close to what the presidential results do. And we think in a scenario where Biden wins by 4, 5, 6 percentage points, the Senate's probably pretty close to 50-50. And if it's a scenario where Biden's winning by like 8, 9, 10 points, that's when, the Democrats can potentially have a clear majority in the Senate. So really, it's just we're thinking that the Senate has increasingly become nationalized. And while there's certainly differences in the states based on the demographics of the states, they all kind of move with what we're seeing the presidential thing doing. Clearly, there are some new voters this cycle who don't usually participate in the process. Do you think this adds uncertainty to forecasting in polls? Yes.
I mean, any more than usual?
We're expecting probably an extra 15 to 20 million voters, more than we had last year. I think that definitely adds uncertainty. Than 2016. I think there's 130. Is that our
estimate for real?
Well, there was 136 million votes cast in 2016. We're expecting maybe about 155 million this year. Okay. That's a lot of new voters. That's a lot of people. It's the largest number of votes cast in the American election ever, and it'll be the largest turnout level in about 100 years of the eligible voting population. Let's see, we have one.
Chris, can I ask the question? Are we estimating that based upon our own sort of enthusiasm scores, or are we taking that from a third party?
Both.
Okay.
I've looked at our enthusiasm score and mapped it to past elections and what that's told us, but also 538 and McDonald from University of Florida. Everyone's saying somewhere between 150, 160.
Okay. Yeah, because the midterms were a spike, and so it's interesting.
Given early voting, do you think there's a danger you're repeating 2016, but instead of underweighting non-college white voters, you're underweighting people of color? Yes, there's always a risk that the electorate changes and it doesn't look like what we think it's going to look like. And I think there is always a risk that you're, to use the expression, fighting the last war. But we are trying to be careful to to take into account these sort of variations. So while yes, that is possible, it's not necessarily what we think is the biggest potential cause for error.
Yeah, but I do think that, I agree with you, but I do think that's an interesting question or point. Like, we could be underestimating Biden.
Yeah, I think Biden could potentially have.
Because Biden might be bringing in people that otherwise wouldn't have voted, and we just as an industry don't do a good job of identifying those people, those one-time voters or new voters, a la 2016. So there's definitely a risk on that side. Not necessarily with people, exclusively with people of color, but on the Democratic side.
Let's see. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Next, what is your take on the concept of social desirability as it plays in polling this year? This is, I think, is probably a reference to the shy Trump theory, which is like everyone's favorite zombie theory, despite talking about it constantly. I mean, Cliff, we've talked about this a lot. I mean, my perspective is that it's certainly possible that there is a group of people that we are not interviewing that is not represented in our surveys, but it's sort of the classic black swan that, there's been a lot of people who've tried to find it and we've not been able to find any real evidence of it. So, there's anecdotal stories about it, but there's no data about it. And in the absence of data, what are we doing? What are we supposed to do to account for it? I think yes, it's possible, but no one's shown anything definitive that it's actually real. And I mean, we have a lot of people in our polls who are very strongly in favor of Donald Trump. So like, they're not shy. And perhaps there are some that are shy, but like we're getting plenty that aren't.
Yeah, I just would add to that. Typically, when we see shy voters, we see them in, more authoritarian environments, like Venezuela, for instance, and they'll hide themselves typically inside the undecideds. We don't see that so much right now, per Chris's point. And moreover, if anything, it's not so much respondents coming to us and changing their answers or hiding their answers. It's much more, us as a polling industry, maybe missing, for instance, the Trump voters that are in places that are hard to reach or they don't respond, if that's happening at all.
Yeah. Let's see. I think we have time for one more question. Did Ipsos make adjustments to sampling weighting methods after 2016? And do you keep watching these issues during the election season? Yes. Yes, we did. I actually spent about 2 weeks after 2016 pulling all of our data apart and putting it back together and trying to compare it against other external benchmarks like the exit polls, which have their own issues. And then again, a couple of times at the early part of this year, using census post-election research and other sort of things to try to make sense of it. And we've done, Ipsos actually globally has done a couple of things around election research. One, we're taking a much more sort of close look at our weighting and our sample designs to make sure that we're accounting for politically important populations. So in 2016, that was non-college whites. In 2020, maybe that's people of color. We're not, sure, of course, but we're looking very close at the relative populations and making sure our surveys are all really good about representing that. Two, we're going to make sure that we're staying in the field as late as possible. So if there are those late shifts like we saw in 2016, Cliff was talking about earlier, we're able to capture that. And I think that's actually an error we made in 2016, where we were actually, essentially the center of gravity for our last polls were 3-4 days before the election. Even in 2018, we actually, didn't have a lot of polls right before the election, so missed some late change. And then number three, we're really making clear the difference between the election poll and the forecast, because it is important to separate those two, that the poll is not the forecast is not the poll. Anything you want to add there, Cliff?
No, I mean, I think you summed it up really well. I mean, but again, great job.
All right. So that's all the time we have. Thanks for joining, Cliff, for the penultimate, the grand finale of our election series. Thank all of you for joining us. We'll put something on the books for after the election to do a post-mortem to sort of recap what we've seen and maybe, talk about what the world looks like under whomever wins and what sort of how the public's responding to it. But, for the next couple of days, be well, good luck. And if you haven't already, make sure to go out and vote.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. There were a number of questions we didn't get to, so you will receive an email back with a response. And that now concludes today's webinar. Be on the lookout for a link to today's recorded presentation. Have a wonderful day.